Good evening and welcome to Opportunity China's third pre-departure webinar for the 2019 Teach China graduate program. Thank you very much to those of you who are joining us once again, who joined us on Monday and yesterday for our previous pre-departure webinars. If you're joining us for the first time live, then welcome. And if you have watched the previous two and are joining us again, it's great to catch up. Remember, this is a really good opportunity to ask any questions that you might have directly to us. We will be able to answer them for you. Just pop them in the chat box on the right-hand side of the video, and I will give ample room for breaks to answer questions after each section of our webinar today. And also, we will have an Opportunity China coordinator on hand to answer any questions that there might be. As I mentioned in yesterday's webinar, there is a slight lag on the streaming. So I may not be able to answer all questions immediately, but please do pop them in there anyway. I will be answering them. You will get an answer to all of them throughout today's session. Well, what are we looking at today? So life outside work, Chinese history, culture, and immersion. When I went to China, first of all, several years ago, I went into my experience with a near complete naivety of Chinese culture, of Chinese history, and there were a lot of things that really kind of confused me when I first went to China. There are a lot of aspects of day-to-day life that were very, very different to what I had experienced in the West, were very different to a lot of the expectations that I had of China, and very different to a lot of the stereotypes that I had of the country as well, and predetermined ideas that were in my head. I think it's important that we discuss these and we discuss things that are important in China to take note of that may be different to things back home. And we look forward to these things as well as looking at some of the more thorny issues that, of course, will exist when living and working in a country like China. But let's start on something really positive, which is China's beauty and diversity. China is, without any doubt, the most diverse and beautiful country that I've ever been to in terms of topography, in terms of what you can see, in terms of the wide range of sites, attractions, and landscapes that scatter this vast country. On the left, bottom left here, you've got the Longji rice terraces in Guangxi province that stretch for miles on end. In the spring times, these flood and create a rainbow cavalcade of colours going all the way down and stretching all the way across the grassy fields. You also have tremendous amounts of beautiful ancient history that is represented by things such as temples or palaces spread throughout different cities in China, creating mini oases amongst the giant metropolitan jungles and landscapes that you'll find. China is a country where to the west you can travel and find the Crescent Lake or the Dunhuang in Gansu province among the great stretches of desert in the Gobi, all the way through to the northeast where you can find the ice tundras in Heilongjiang province and visit the world famous ice festival in Harbin, which is home to scale models of famous world landmarks, home to ice hotels and cafes where you can sit and drink. It really is one of the most amazing things if you can brave the minus 40 degrees Celsius temperature. It's also home, China is also home to Zhangjiajie, one of the most breathtaking national parks in the entire world. You can see on the bottom left there the mountains of Zhangjiajie, the floating mountains that inspired and actually were directly cut and placed into the movie Avatar. And of course, you have the endless sprawling metropolises that make up the cities of China, no more so than a place like Shanghai, with one of the most breathtaking skyscapes that you will ever see in your entire life. There are a lot of different sites within the destinations that many of you will be traveling to. On the top left, you can see Nanhou Street, Nanhoujie in Fuzhou, for those of you who are going to be teaching there. An excellent area and district of largely modern city that really does preserve the old-time nature of that southeastern feel. You also have imperial palaces scattered throughout different cities like Beijing and Shenyang. In the bottom, you can see here the skyscape of Shenzhen, and the skyline there of one of China's most modern and vibrant cities. You can see, for those of you who are going to Foshan, the giant statue of Bruce Lee in a square where many people will practice Kung Fu. On the right here, for those of you who are going to be in Jiangsu province, in Wuxi or Nanjing, you have the Lingshan Buddha, one of the largest Buddhas in the entire world. It's a hell of a hike to get up there, but it's definitely worth seeing. For those of you in the north, you have the Great Wall of China, the most famous landmark. There is a great opportunity that you're going to have when living in China to actually trek along this and find some of the more isolated areas, some of the more less touristy parts. You'll have a lot of time to explore this tremendous landmark that stretches across a very large portion of this enormous country. And for those of you in the west, in Chengdu and Chongqing, the mountains and fjords and rivers that spread throughout that central western part of China, including one of the world's most breathtaking viewing bridges that you can see just there as well. And let's take a look at some of the content that we are going to cover today. We'll start by taking a glance at modern Chinese history and culture. China, of course, has 5,000 years of history and civilization, but I think it's important to condense it into a modern take and to find out exactly how and why Chinese behavior is the way it is at the moment, and some of those important sensitivity and pressure points that exist in China today as well. We'll be talking about the Great Firewall and social media, the restrictions that will exist for those of you who are heading to China and how you can get around those. We'll be talking about getting around China and transportation. What are the best modes of travel? How expensive is it going to be? How easy is it to use? We'll be taking a look at food in China, which is an incredibly important social and cultural aspect of living in China, as well as an important practical part. And we'll also be taking a brief look at leisure and entertainment. You might be wondering what is going to be open to you, what's going to be different, what things are going to feel the same, what things are going to feel different. We'll be taking a look at some of the options that will be open to you there. Let's take a look, first of all, at an introduction to Chinese history. As I mentioned, it is an ancient country. It is based on over 5,000 years of continuous civilization, and for the vast majority of that 5,000 years, it's been ruled by dynasties, and separated into various different kingdoms with various different cultures. And this really does still exist in China today. Those of you who are going to be living in the northeast of China will experience a very different culture, a very different kind of society and way of life and way of being to those of you who are going to be in the south, in, say, Guangdong province, those of you who are going to be in Shenzhen or Foshan. It will almost be like a different country to you. There are going to be similar themes. There are going to be similar cultural elements that we spread throughout, and these are going to be things that we will cover. But those of you who are going to be in the north of China with a very direct way of speaking, a very direct way of interacting with one another, compared to the more abstract way of thinking and speaking in the south, will have a very different experience indeed. In 1912, those dynasties and kingdoms came to an end, and China was united under the banner of the Republic of China, under Sun Yat-sen, with its initial capital being in Nanjing in Jiangsu province. In 1927, a fierce civil war broke out between the communists and nationalists in China. The nationalists represented by the Kuomintang, the communists represented by the CPC, the Communist Party of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And in 1949, the communists declared victory. The nationalists largely fled to Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, the China as we know today, was formed. Now, you may notice that 1949 date, that is going to be very important, as in October this year, China will be celebrating its 70th anniversary. The vast majority of you who are going to be listening to this will be there during that time, so this is certainly going to be something very special for you to see. There'll be lots of parades, lots of celebrations. It really will be a very important landmark in China's history that a lot of you will be present to see. So this is going to be something really fantastic for you. It's important to discuss China in a context of its 20th century struggle as well, when understanding the reason for a lot of sensitivities that exist in China today. The 20th century in China was fraught with hardship and struggle. From 1927 until 1950, so in 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed, but that civil war went on after it. The Chinese Civil War took the lives of over 8 million people. That's merely an estimate. It's been hard to keep track of those who died during it. In between that, and in the middle of that, between 1937 and 1945, the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, or as we know it more commonly, part of World War II in the East, took place in China, leaving an estimated 22 million civilians dead. Following this, there were a large number of reforms that were taken out in the early years of the People's Republic of China and under Mao's leadership. The Great Leap Forward during the Civil War, the Long March, as well as the eradication of the pests, which led to the Great Chinese Famine. This, again, has an estimated number, but it is around 45 million people dead as a result of the famine, and also as a result of various political and structural reforms. Following the Great Leap Forward and the reforms that were attempted then, there was another attempt at mass reform in China, which came about in form of the Cultural Revolution, renewal of a new state, of a new people. There was an attempt to forge a new world and to undo what was seen as being non-revolutionary thinking. During the Cultural Revolution, there was a tremendous amount of fear, a tremendous amount of terror that was enacted by the Red Guard in China. Academics were rounded up and killed. Anyone who spoke in an anti-revolutionary manner or were deemed to be anti-revolutionary were purged. Many people in China and many young people in China were taken out of the classroom and into the fields to plow, to farm, and to learn the ways of the peasants. This had a tremendous effect culturally, but also had a tremendous effect on people and their well-being. And again, millions were estimated to have died as a result of this. Now, because of this, a lot of behavior exists in China that revolves around the importance of wanting to keep children very safe at all times. You will see a lot of mollycoddling happening because of this, because one generation, and particularly among those, the grandparents who lived through this time, they don't ever want to see children children being put in harm's way, or children being put in danger of going hungry, or being seen as being someone who may be dangerous in the eyes of others. But this century of struggle has led now to what is the emerging superpower of China today. In Deng Xiaoping, in 1976, Deng Xiaoping emerged as the de facto leader of China following Mao's death. In 1978, opening up of China began, and in 1979, the market model of economic reforms happened, and China entered a stage of what is called, and still is called now, opening up and reform. This process of time was largely personified by the birth of a particular city in China, which was Shenzhen in the south. You can see here Shenzhen in 1980, just after opening up and reform had started. Shenzhen was announced as a city in 1979, and you can see Shenzhen today, a giant metropolis that has been birthed through a former fishing village, a former agricultural area. As opening up and reform happened, and as China opened its doors to the rest of the world to trade with and to work with, there's been an average growth of 10% total GDP per year until 2015. China has also experienced the largest urbanization of any population in the history of mankind, the largest migration from rural to city living. And there's become an emergence of megacities in China as a result of this. There's a burgeoning middle class that's found wealth for the first time. Millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty and into this comfortable style of living where they're wanting to explore the world for the very first time. And this has created a very enthusiastic, very energetic society where people are wanting to get things done, wanting to build on things, and wanting to build what is called at the moment as part of Xi Jinping's China Dream Initiative, a moderately prosperous society for everyone. Well, China today is home to over 160 cities with populations in excess of 1 million, the largest urban project in human history. It's home to that modern and growing middle class that's curious about that's curious about things beyond its borders, that wants to stretch beyond the previously enclosed nature of China during the 20th century. China is competing in the global marketplace very strongly for the first time. This has had incredibly positive effects in many different ways. China is no longer seen as simply a purveyor of tat. There are many high-quality industries that are being founded in China, and high-quality products that are coming out of China, as well as high-end companies existing. This, of course, is one of the factors that's led to the current trade war with the United States. This burgeoning economy and this quality that's coming through that is for the first time posing a threat to the United States since the Cold War. China is innovating for the future, broadly speaking for itself, but it is wanting to work with other countries. More and more companies from China are looking at establishing bases in countries abroad, looking at working and interacting with them. China is very much global facing for the first time. But also, it's looking back on its own history. A huge amount of what is currently going on in China is about buying back and taking back its culture and heritage that was broadly destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. It is still about accepting that the government and the Communist Party is still very much in power in China, but they are now accepting those 5,000 years of history as being legitimate and as being something that should be celebrated. You'll see very often when pieces of art are sold for exorbitant prices in the West, in auctions that take place in places like London and New York, they're almost always being sold to a phone bidder who's from China, and those auction rooms are filled up with the Chinese middle class or Chinese museums buying back their history. But most of all, China is global facing and international in its outlook. China is wanting to spread out to the rest of the world. China is wanting to interact, wanting to work with, wanting to do business with, wanting to exchange cultures and ideas with the rest of the world, which makes it the most exciting country to work with at the moment, and arguably the country that has the most opportunity for those looking to break into and to understand. There are still, though, some hard truths that you have to accept with this country that is open to foreigners coming, that is open to people from other countries and other cultures sharing ideas. There is an enormous emphasis in China on stability and authority. A lot of this comes from this very tragic past. A lot of this comes from the fact that China has been very disunited for most of its 5,000 years of history. And a lot of it comes from the fact that the system of government and the culture of China, that role of the hierarchy of people, is very, very important. There is no real freedom of press in China. Many of you will know this. All forms of press and media in China are directly controlled by the Communist Party of China. But that's not to say that the forms of press that we have in this country, by and large, are controlled by people who work in the media and are millionaires who have their own agenda and their own issues as well. But, you know, it is something that is very much controlled by a central body in China. And as part of that, freedom of assembly, like protests, like getting out among lots of different people and protesting something that you would take for granted in countries like the United Kingdom and in the United States, are simply not allowed in China. There aren't demonstrations, they don't happen. When they do happen, it's not a good idea whatsoever to get involved. Wounds are still sore from a tragic past. There have been many instances where China has suffered and seen the rest of the world almost turn its back on them. And this can lead to a sensitivity and also a particular pride that China takes at the moment. Discussion of politics is not really the norm in China, unless you're in Beijing. If you're in Beijing, a lot of people always talk politics. But discussion of politics in many places isn't the norm. There is criticism that you'll hear of certain things, but usually speaking openly about particular ideas or criticizing things in a particular way is an area to steer clear of. Of course, if you're among your expat friends, absolutely, that's fine. If you're speaking with Chinese people, be aware of those sensitivities that they might have to a Westerner, to a foreigner coming to their country and telling them how they feel their country should be run. There is that attitude that comes from that, which is we don't interfere in what your country does, so you shouldn't interfere in what our country does. It's a country to watch, a country to learn from, a country to see things in. It's a country where I vehemently disagree with many things, where I have a lot of opinions, but you've got to be diplomatic in how you express these in China, if you choose to express them at all. And as part of that, particularly at the moment in China, there is a very strong sense of patriotism and a very sensitive nature at the moment as well, especially regarding things such as the trade war that's currently going on. It's better to avoid these kinds of subjects. It's better to avoid altogether anything that could be sensitive when speaking about relations between China and the US. People in China will almost always treat you for who you are as an individual. They'll be curious about where you're from. They'll be curious about what you do. On an individual to individual basis, China is friendly, it's welcoming. I have never experienced any issues with people that I've interacted with in China on the basis of being a foreigner, on the basis of being from the country that I'm from. But you probably will see things in the news that can be quite antagonistic and critical of the United Kingdom and the United States. But it's important not to be worried by that, not to be scared by that. The will from people that you will meet will almost always be very good. But it is very important to remember to think about when you might want to bite your tongue on certain issues in China. So questions on Chinese history, introduction, society. I see that we have one already. Please do write any others if anyone does have one. How are LGBT people treated in China? Can you be fired for being gay, having a partner of the same gender? I'm quite open about it at home in the UK and don't want to face repercussions. Shannon, that's a really, really good question and a really fair question. In China, you will not be fired for being gay. That won't happen. As with any relationship, if you are at work, China is a very conservative country in terms of how people express emotion. So when I was in China, even with my partner, I wouldn't hold hands with her if I was sort of near a place of work. And that would be the same whether you are gay, lesbian, bisexual, wherever and whatever you are. It's important more to note the conservative nature of relationships in China as opposed to being of a specific sexual orientation. LGBT in and of itself is not an issue in China. It is, I'm not going to pretend that it is at the level of understanding within society that exists in the United States and the United Kingdom. You may have Chinese friends who might make comments that are not intended to be offensive, but may come across as ignorant to us because there aren't the organizations that exist in China, that exist in places like the UK and the US to help spread awareness of it. I've had many LGBT friends living in China. who have not experienced persecution or violence because of that. You certainly won't experience it in the workplace. In fact, as an example of that, one of the closest friends I had in Shenyang in China, which is a very conservative part of China, ran a school, and he was gay, he was Chinese, and he had a Western partner. It certainly won't get in the way of your professional life, and you certainly won't be fired for being gay. It is absolutely fine to be open about it, to tell people that you're gay, but as a broader point to make to everyone, China, going back to that conservative nature of relationships in China, it's nothing like being in the Middle East. But if you are a PDA in any sense, no matter what your orientation, it's maybe best to avoid it quite so much in China, as it is sort of a little taboo. Let's take a look now at getting around in China, the modes of transport, how you can get from place to place in the country. First of all, public transport within the city where you're living. Cost for this does vary from city to city. If you are living in a city like Shanghai, it's likely going to be very different to a city like Chengdu in terms of cost. The best and cheapest way of traveling that I have always found are buses. Buses in China are in abundance in every single city. You can find a route for wherever you want to go. You can speak with your colleagues. You can use apps, and you can use maps in China. Apple Maps has a built-in bus service schedule for wherever you want to get to. But the best part of traveling by bus within your city in China is that the cost of a journey, no matter how far you're going or where you're going within city limits, is between 1 and 2 kwai or renminbi. This is about 10, 11 pence to 21, 22p for each journey. Then, of course, there are metro services. There are metro services in almost every major second and first tier city in China. These are all very new, they're all very fancy. The vast majority have had the largest parts of their networks built from the 21st century onwards. So they are quite spacious, quite modern, and have air conditioning as well in those hotter times. They can get incredibly busy, and it can be a fair bit of a squeeze to get on if you're traveling in rush hour, particularly if you're in first tier cities like Shenzhen, Beijing, or Shanghai. The cost of traveling on a metro is generally between around 2 to 6 renminbi per journey. Again, incredibly cheap when you compare it to the cost of traveling on the rather antiquated Western metro systems. Then, of course, there's getting a taxi. The starting rates of taxis are generally between 8 and 13 renminbi, and are usually that for the first 3 kilometers of your journey. So again, very cheap. You can also hail a Didi, which is the Chinese equivalent of an Uber. I will go into a little more detail on Didi and car hailing apps a little bit later on. You can also rent bikes in China. This is emerging as being one of the most popular ways of traveling in the country within cities. Free for the first hour, then 1 renminbi per hour, incredibly cheap to use. Things like Mobike and GoBike are very popular in China, and you'll be able to use your phone once you have your bank account set up to simply scan a barcode, pay automatically from your bank account, and you are on the go. But what about going outside of your city and exploring the country? Well, China is home to the largest and most extensive high-speed rail network. The high-speed rail trains have a maximum speed of around 186 miles per hour. They glide along as smoothly as you like. To give you an idea of how quickly you can get between places, you can get between northern Beijing and southeastern Shanghai in just 4 hours and 48 minutes. This is an incredibly short distance time if you want to go into Google Maps and take a look at how far it is to drive there. There are also a lot of sleeper trains in China that are cheap and effective if you want to travel a little bit further and fancy having an experience like that. There are cheap internal flights in China as well, as the tax is not heavy whatsoever. I recommend using Ctrip or what has now been rebranded simply as Trip to book your tickets if you're going from city to city or flying somewhere. What is a good tip to take on board is to ask a Chinese friend that you have if they can use their Chinese language app to book, because actually it's much cheaper on the Chinese language version of Trip or Ctrip than it is on the English language version. Does anyone have any questions about transportation in China? Okay, let's take a look now at food in China. Food is an incredibly important part of Chinese life, society, and culture. When it comes to dining in China, there are all kinds of etiquettes that you're going to learn, that you're going to get wrong like I did, and that you're going to feel embarrassed by, but there are also many more that you are going to enjoy greatly. When it comes to eating in China, you'll very quickly find a pretty fluid way that'll exist for most people. So there are lots of plates that will be placed on the table, usually on a spinning jenny. Each restaurant in China will be gauged on its quality by the amount of noise that is taking place, as eating is a very communal activity. It's not about the ambiance, it's about the noise, it's about the discussion, it's about the event and the atmosphere that you will experience whilst you are there. It is a really fun place restaurants are really fun places to go to. At the end of the day, it gives you an opportunity to eat a lot if you want, to drink a lot. It's important to be aware of cultural norms whilst you're dining, if you're dining with Chinese people, especially if you're dining with your boss. You will be taught this by a lot of your Chinese friends. It's something really handy and quite cool to have up your sleeve as a bit of cultural knowledge as well. One thing is making sure that the person with the most authority, again, we're going back to that idea of hierarchy that exists in China, is sitting facing the door. This signifies that they are there to welcome everyone who's coming in. Ganbeiing is also a really important part of Chinese culture, whether you're drinking alcohol or just whether you're drinking a soft drink. Clearing your glass or toasting or cheersing with someone next to you. Very often in China, in most parts of China, people will not drink and on their own. So they won't sit there with their food and their drink and take a sip and then eat their food. They will only drink when someone else or they propose to someone else that they want to drink with them. So you'll toast them, then have a drink, and then eat your food, then toast with someone else, then have your drink, then eat your food. It can be quite confusing at first, and it can be quite embarrassing. It took me a very long time to get my head around that side of the culture. When you are drinking with someone, again, whether you're drinking alcohol or whether you're drinking a soft drink, it's important to toast lower down on the glass of a person with authority. It shows respect for them, it shows deference as well, which is incredibly important in Chinese culture, with the Chinese having that nature of hierarchy and importance being placed on figures of high authority. When it comes to China, there are lots of different regional cuisines that exist, and Chinese food that we have in the West, particularly in Britain, is very different to Chinese food that exists in the country itself. Now, each of these regional cuisines finds itself present in every single part of the country. So in Guangdong, in the Canton region, in places like Shenzhen, you will find restaurants that will have Sichuan food from the west, that will have seafood from Shandong in the east. But you will get the best type of food if you are living in the region where it is made and where it's famous for. So for those of you who are going to be heading to Chengdu or Chongqing around Sichuan region, you're going to have some really, really spicy food. It is the most delicious, flavorful food that you can possibly imagine. In Chongqing in particular, you have Chongqing hot pot, which will, for the uninitiated, take your head off. But the food is very popularly made with chilies that are ground. Lots of really delicious spicy vegetables as well as meats will be available for you at that time. In Sichuan, it is that sort of hot and spicy type. In Hunan, for those of you who might be going to Changsha or areas around there, it's a very hot and sour taste. Now, for those of you who are going to Jiangsu region, so to Nanjing or Wuxi, or those of you who are going to Shanghai, or those of you teaching in the Zhejiang region in Ningbo or Hangzhou, you will expect to find a sort of light, sweet tasting food. And that goes for those of you who are going to be teaching in the Guangdong region in Shenzhen or in Foshan as well. This is the most similar kind of food to what we have in the West. So your sort of sweet and sour foods and bits and pieces like that. But if you are living in Guangdong province in Shenzhen or Foshan, you'll very quickly come to know the stereotype about people from Guangdong. The stereotype is that people from Guangdong will eat anything that has 4 legs. They'll eat anything that flies. They'll eat anything that flies that isn't a plane, anything with 4 legs that isn't a table, anything with 2 legs that isn't a man. There is a huge amount of weird and wonderful foods that you will see in Guangdong that will be available to you, and I highly recommend trying some of them. I myself sampled some scorpion when I last was there. I also have eaten a lot of grubs and insects that were surprisingly delicious, but you by no means are restricted to that type of food. There is a lot of, inverted commas, normal food available in China and in the south as well. In Fujian and Anhui province, so for those of you who are going to be going to Fuzhou in particular, there's a lot of wild mountainous foods that will be available, as well as seafoods along that coast too. And those of you who might be a little bit further up around Beijing, there'll be a lot of Shandong influence, a lot of seafood influence there, as well as some very famous Beijing staples such as Beijing or Peking style duck or chicken as well. So here you can get a little bit of an idea of some of the foods that are going to be on offer in China for you. You can see on the top left there some very spicy Sichuan food, some sweet southern food there, as well as some wild ingredients that you can see along the right, and also a seafood on the top right hand as well. When it comes to restaurants in China, as I've mentioned already, you'll have a lot of traditional Chinese restaurants, as well as a lot of chain restaurants that you will popularly begin to notice, including Mr. Li's, which is a really fantastic and cheap Chinese fast food joint. It's a lot healthier than Western fast food styles, where you can get noodles and rice dishes that are absolutely delicious. I'm already getting incredibly hungry now just thinking about them. You can get those very cheap for around 6, 7, 8 kwai a go. You also have a lot of global fast food and coffee chains available, your Starbucks, your Costas, your McDonald's, your KFCs, even your Burger Kings. There are also a lot of Western-centric restaurants that are scattered throughout 2nd and 1st tier, and even some modern Western-style 3rd tier cities in China. These Western-centric restaurants are very, sometimes quite expensive, but they're definitely worth it for, for the home comforts and treats of being able to get back and try something like that. For those of you who are going to be vegetarian or vegan, there are, again, an abundance of options that will be available to you. That isn't to say that living in China is the easiest thing in the whole world, being a vegan or a vegetarian, as there is a lot of meat that will be available. However, there are a lot of Buddhists in China who do still practice veganism, and people in China and figures of authority in China are incredibly understanding and accommodating for those of you who are vegan or vegetarian when you're going out with them. If you're looking for a great vegan or vegetarian restaurant in China, use happycow.net. All of the cities in China will have listings that are based on there, and there are some really, really great finds that you can get there too. There was a really great vegan restaurant that was run by Tibetan Buddhists in the city of Shenyang, where I lived. That's actually a picture of it just in the top right-hand corner, as I'll always remember. They used to make a lot of faux meat products out of things like tofu. It was really quite entertaining to watch, but it was the most delicious place in the entire world I've ever eaten. So questions on food in China, or any other questions that we've been answering so far? I see that my colleague has answered a few questions in our chat already. Yes, absolutely agree with my colleague with regards to driving in China. You would need to get a license. You can actually apply to get a Chinese driving license with your license and have it transferred over. You can have someone help you with that. However, I really, really wouldn't recommend doing it whatsoever, as my colleague has said, within a city center in China. If you're new to China, the methods of driving are very, very different indeed. The test is very different, and people have not necessarily worse, but very different standards of driving in China. So it can be quite scary to do so. A new question. So accommodation when traveling. If I were to travel for a weekend, would accommodation be expensive? No, not at all. So you can get some very, very reasonable, and still quite nice hotels in China for the equivalent of between 15 and 20 pounds. If you're wanting to stay in a hostel when you're traveling, you can get that from as little as about £3 or £4 in pretty much all attractive tourist destinations that you want to go to. So accommodation is incredibly cheap when traveling China. Again, I recommend using Trip or Ctrip, as it's called, when you are booking an accommodation option in China, as you'll be able to find the best possible rates for you there as well. You need to remember to take your passport. You will have biometric scans done of you when you go to hotels in China, where they'll take a picture of your face and keep you on record as being there. Shannon, I already have an in-date DBS, so do I need a new one? I got an order to be a scout leader, but it's definitely a DBS. So we would always recommend getting it may well be in date for the purposes of using in the United Kingdom, but within China, depending on the bureau of the region that you are going to, they need it to be completed within the last 3 to 6 months. So I would recommend still getting a basic DBS check before you go. Shannon, are hostels safe to stay in? Again, yes, but check out reviews. A really good tip when using Trip or Ctrip is to take a look at the reviews that are on there, look at the English language reviews that have been left by people. What I would usually recommend is not staying in a place that only has Chinese language reviews left by them, staying in a place that has English language reviews left in it as well, if it is a hostel. But broadly speaking, hostels are incredibly safe in China. They can be quite lively places. You will generally find a lot of people sometimes smoking and drinking in hostels in China, but a lot of that is part of the culture that exists there, especially among young people. You won't find it threatening whatsoever. They are generally incredibly unthreatening places. Airbnb, really good question, Carla. So Airbnb does exist in China. It certainly does exist in China. Again, when it comes to using Airbnb, there are the sort of common sense things that you want to abide by. Don't stay in an Airbnb that doesn't have any reviews for it. And again, I'd use the same logic as if booking a hostel on Ctrip. Use English language reviews as a guideline when you're looking for it as well. Sometimes in China, you can have review bots or companies paying Chinese to leave lots and lots of fake reviews. So again, taking a look at English language reviews and taking a look at the sort of language that's been used to describe places as well. So the Great Firewall. There are a lot of sites in China that are inaccessible. Many of you will know this already, and there are ways that you are able to get around it. There are legal ways as a foreigner that you are able to get around it. But as a simple matter of fact, sites that you can't access include Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all Google sites, including Gmail, and also YouTube. With websites in China, There are a lot of alternatives that exist to these, but of course, being from the West, pretty much your entire internet life will depend on using these websites. So the way in which you are able to access them is via a VPN. So using a VPN in China is quite simple. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. Essentially what it does is it sets up, the VPN sets up your IP address as being within a country outside of China. So it effectively makes it look like you are in a different country. There are numerous different providers. You often pay a monthly subscription to them. I always recommend paying for a year's subscription flat out. You can download and install them before you go to China. We do recommend using ExpressVPN. It tends to be the most reliable option. I actually have it myself. I'll just quickly show you what a VPN will look like. I won't actually turn it on, but a VPN will download as an app on your screen. It'll look like this. It'll have a big red button on the side. You just select the location that you want to use, say the United Kingdom, Netherlands, pretty much anywhere. I always recommend using a location that's close to where you are. So if you are in China, go to Asia Pacific and use, say, Singapore or Hong Kong as an option, because these two are very, very close to to mainland China, and you're able to access it from there. So going back, there are a lot of popular social media platforms in China that you may very much be unfamiliar with. These include WeChat, which is the most popular social media messaging service. It's essentially WhatsApp and Facebook and all sorts rolled into one. You can also use it to pay for items as well when you connect it to your phone. You've also got Weibo, which is a micro-blogging site in China. It's essentially the equivalent of Chinese Twitter. It is a really interesting site to utilize if you are, it's a really interesting site to utilize if you're wanting to get an idea of sort of what the Chinese zeitgeist is. It's something really cool to talk to your Chinese friends about what they like to post on Weibo, and to get an idea of sort of what the vibe and what the feeling among Chinese culture is at the moment, as we can sometimes feel a little blocked off. You've also got Dianping, which is essentially the Chinese equivalent of Yelp. It's really great for looking at reviews for different restaurants and different places in China. You will be spoiled for choice when it comes to restaurants and attractions that exist. You've also got Douban, which is essentially a sort of music-y, Spotify-y, SoundCloud-y kind of app. It's really great for streaming music. You get a huge amount free on there, a huge amount of Western music for free. In my opinion, it's considerably better than using Spotify. Here are a few really useful Chinese apps that you will utilize whilst you are in China. So first of all, you've got the Baidu services. Baidu is the Chinese alternative to Google, as Google is blocked in China. I wouldn't recommend using Baidu as a search engine. I'd recommend using something like Bing if your VPN is down, but Baidu's apps are great. So instead of Google Maps, use Baidu Maps. It's fantastic. It is without any doubt far and away the best map service to use in China. You can get it in English language, which is great. I didn't have it in English language when I was in China, so it's come on leaps and bounds. Makes it nice and easy for you as well. There's also Baidu Translate. Again, instead of using blocked Google services, if your VPN's down, using Baidu Translate is really handy. Again, you can use it in English. It has a voice service where you can speak into it and it will translate directly to the person speaking with you. There's also Alipay, which is a popular service to pay for things in China, from using it on vending machines to using it in shops. In pretty much all cities, you will very quickly see that China is practically a cashless country in its urban environments. People will use Alipay to scan a barcode at a shop, Even with a street vendor, they'll scan a barcode on the street vendor's phone when buying some fruit and put in the amount of money that they owe to the street vendor. It will come straight out of their account, go straight into the street vendor's account, and the same with absolutely everything else. It's a really efficient and really fun way of paying for things in China. Again, it's something that has developed and emerged over the last 3 or so years. It actually wasn't there when I was in China. When I was living in China, it was pretty much all cash. So it'll be a very different experience for you whilst you're there as well. Another thing that's emerged and become very popular in China over the last few years has been Didi, which is a car hailing app, essentially the Chinese version of Uber. Now, Didi, you can either order a Didi with drivers that have reviews and have been safety vetted, or you can actually use it to hail a regular licensed taxi that will come and get you. Again, a Didi will be connected to your bank account, will be connected to your phone, so cash will be able to flow straight out of it. You will largely find that you won't be using a huge amount of cash in China once you have your bank account set up, largely because of these apps. So questions on the Great Firewall and social media. I've noticed a few came in. My colleague has answered. So VPNs, are VPNs illegal if we are caught with them, etc.? Yeah, really good question. As my colleague says, all foreign people in China do use them. Many Chinese citizens use them too. They are clamping down on their accessibility, but not necessarily on using it. So when I say that, what I mean is there will be some times where you'll get frustrated about connecting to a particular VPN. You'll need to change. So you might try to connect to Hong Kong VPN, but that will not be going through because the authorities will have found a way of blocking that VPN. So you can just use a Singapore VPN, you can do another VPN, another VPN, another VPN, till eventually you'll find it. It can sometimes be a little bit frustrating, but it's absolutely fine. The men in black suits will certainly not come and take you away if you have a VPN. To give you a little bit of context to that, I once, a friend of mine worked as part of, doing proofreading for part of the Chinese central government in the city where I was living. And the Chinese central government asked to borrow his VPN that he was using because theirs had gone down. So a lot of people do still use VPNs for various things, but they can sometimes get blocked out, which can be quite frustrating. Particular times of year, VPNs can sometimes go down as well. If there are particularly sensitive news stories that are going around, they can go down at those times too. Yes, you can use VPNs on your phone as well. You can download, but do make sure you download the app before you leave China, because of course the VPN services themselves are blocked in China, so you can't go on the iStore once you're there and download it. It works exactly the same if you use a service like VPN Express or Viper. The display is exactly the same as big red button, very user friendly. Just select where you want to use it, and there you go. So entertainment and leisure in China, what will you be doing in your spare time whilst you're there? Well, there is an abundance of options available to you. First of all, there is cinema and films. In China, there are a lot of Chinese films that are coming out. There are sometimes screenings of classical Chinese films, which are, in my opinion, considerably better than quite a lot of modern Chinese cinema that comes out, which is very often high-octane action blockbusters, which are, in my opinion, a little bit rubbish. The older Chinese cinema, if you have an opportunity to go to a cinema to see some of those films, is really, really worth going to. There are also a lot of English language films that are released in China. There are 34 foreign language releases permitted by the Chinese government each year. And these films are usually the most popular kinds of films that are currently out in the West at any one particular time. So it is definitely worth going to the cinema and viewing these with your British friends or Chinese friends whilst you are there. There are an abundance of expat bars, clubs, and restaurants that are available for you to hang out in addition to those traditional Chinese restaurants and areas that I mentioned earlier, considering how important eating is in Chinese culture and the culture around eating. So the vast majority of expat hotspots are located close to major embassies or consulates within the city where you're based. You will pretty much all be introduced by your colleagues to these areas where you're going to be hanging out, where you may well be congregating for much of your time in China, but they're really great social places to be. A lot of them tend to have things like open mic nights for foreigners to participate in, as well as lots of different entertainment, pool tables, table football. There really are far better amenities in Chinese social places than there are in the West. It's something that I really miss about the country quite greatly. China's also home to a lot of state-of-the-art sports centres and facilities, where you'll have the opportunity to go and utilize them for keeping fit, for using gyms, going swimming, or doing things like playing badminton, tennis, five-a-side football. There's a lot of really great sports teams and leagues that exist in China. Many of you who are going to public schools, a lot of the public school organizations and private language school organizations also have their own football teams made up of foreigners who compete in local city leagues in China. But there's also all kinds of other sports that are played. On the bottom right-hand corner, that is actually the Shenzhen Gallic football team that one of our teachers played in and represented, which is, you know, as diverse as you can get in terms of options that are available to you. It is a really exciting and interesting place. It is great to socialize with Chinese in more traditional Chinese ways. If you're going out for a meal, as I say, restaurants are the most popular option, but also going for a massage or going to a tea house are really great cultural things that you can do as well. But these are some of the more Western-centric entertainment options that you will have in China whilst you are there. So tomorrow we're going to be looking at making the most of your China experience, but just now, before I leave you, I'll answer any questions that you might have that are still here. So Carla, going back to transport and traveling, do people speak English in train stations, etc. if I were to travel around and have no one with me? That's a fantastic question, Carla. The answer to that is it very much depends on where you are traveling from. So if you are traveling from a main first, or even broadly speaking, a main second tier city in China, there will be someone at the train station who will speak English, and there will be a window that will be marked saying it is an English speaking booth. If you are not, don't worry at all. It is actually a really straightforward process. So you will book all of your train tickets. You'll book all of your train tickets in China on Ctrip. It is pretty much the only app you'll want to book them on. You will, once you've booked your tickets, need to go to a booth. You don't even need to say anything. You just need to show them the ticket number and hand them over your passport, and they will type it in a little computer, print out their tickets and hand them over to you. All instruction and all names of cities and gates of where you're going from train stations in China will have English writing on them as well. Even in the most remote areas on the boards, they will have English writing on them. So they will be relatively easy to navigate their way through. But just remember, when you go to a booth in China, hand them over the phone with the reference number on it, your passport, they'll print out your ticket for you. You've got no problem whatsoever. Something's been worrying me about medication. Okay, for medication. But not read not to bring medication to China. How do I go back on my prescription? That's great. So yes, again, as my colleague says, you'll need to get a letter from your GP to accompany that prescription. Again, we do request getting at least a 6-month prescription too. Try to get as much as you can for as long as you can before you go. Also, informing your school is incredibly important. With this, your school's HR department will be able to help you out with this. They will be able to go to doctors with you and send someone with you to help you with that. If you've been there for a long enough time to have one of your friends help you do it, they'll be more than happy to do that with you as well. This is a situation that a lot of people find themselves going into China with, but honestly, it's not as scary as it might seem at first. like my colleague says, we recommend getting a prescription as much as you can, informing your school, and going to a doctor's with a member from your school who's asked, or a Chinese friend if you feel more comfortable doing that after a few months as well. Claudia, does this also sound for the contraceptive pill? Yes. So we do recommend getting as much as you can if you do, if you are taking contraceptive pills. Contraceptive pills are available in China, but they are not to the same safety standards that we have here in the West, and it is also not as common in China to be used. You can go with a friend or colleague to go and get them. One of my close friends did that whilst she was in China. But again, getting as large a prescription as you can before you go is very important. Getting a 12-month supply is what we would recommend. Carla, are we not allowed to bring medications or travel with antibiotics, just in case my home country will not be able? Yes, Carla, you, broadly speaking, most medications you will be able to bring with you. It's important to check what you can't. China is largely okay with the vast majority of types of medications. I'm always bringing antibiotics in and out of the country as I go. I also bring a letter to accompany this. Yes, Claudia, it's always better to be safe than sorry when bringing medication into China, especially if you're bringing large amounts in. In the vast majority of cases, medication like antibiotics, like the contraceptive pill, are okay to bring into China. Again, it is worth checking, but it's better safe than sorry to bring a letter with you. And I'll just leave it just a couple more seconds if anyone else has any questions. Myself and my colleagues seem to be answering in tandem somewhat. So I'll just give you a couple of moments. Shannon, so once again, it very much depends on the medication that you're bringing in. But if you have a letter from your GP stating that you need it, then yes, that's absolutely fine. We would recommend taking a look online and seeing what products are restricted from being brought into China to see if it's relevant for you. We can't offer any form of medical advice per se on this, so we are quite cautious about giving explicit advice for this. But taking a look on there is very important, and seeing what is prohibited. But when you compare a country like China to a country like Japan or Australia, the restrictions are actually surprisingly less harsh than in those countries. But even if your prescription is not on the list of prohibited items to bring in, we do still recommend bringing a letter with you just in case, but you should be absolutely fine. And are there any other questions just for the moment? Okay, fantastic. Well, in which case, thank you very much for joining me once again. Tomorrow, our webinar is going to be on making the most of your China experience. So taking the experience that you've had from China, taking the skills that you've learned, and transferring them into something for the future that you might want to do. So thank you very much once again for joining me. I hope you join us again tomorrow, but have a lovely evening and see you very soon.